Hi, welcome to EC&M Tech Talks. This is a series of how-to videos where we talk about everything from the equipment that we use out in the field to the codes and standards that apply, especially to the installation, the NEC in other words. But we also talk about the maintenance and safety aspects of our equipment as well. And working on it, right? The bottom line is that we go home safely every day. No matter how qualified we are, no matter how much we know about the NEC, we got to keep ourselves safe on the job. That's what we're going to be talking about today is electrical safety and the changes to the NFPA 70E standard for 2024. Now, this Tech Talk is brought to you by EC&M Magazine, Electrical Construction and Maintenance Magazine. So if you haven't already, you go to ecmweb.com, ecmweb.com. And in the upper left-hand corner, there's a little, you click on the menu and there's a drop-down menu. And the very first item is premium content. You want to make sure that you sign up for the premium content if you haven't already. One, it's free. And two is you get tons of free information, all right? Not only on this topic of safety today, but everything else to do with the installation, maintenance, and safety when we work on our electrical equipment. So anyway, I'm Randy Barnett. I'm your host for today. My background is I'm a journeyman electrician by trade. And my job is to keep things practical as we go through. So we're talking about the NFPA 70E 2024 edition. It's titled The Standard for Electrical Safety in the Workplace, and I'm sure you're familiar with it. Now, it has changed. First thing, there are no huge, major, gigantic revisions that, oh my gosh, I've got to change my entire electrical safety program. I've got to buy all this PPE. We've got to send all these people to training. It's going to be, oh my gosh, it's terrible, okay? Nothing like that. There are quite a few changes. You see, there were, well over 300, almost 400 proposals, or what we call public inputs now, into the NFPA 70E, meaning people wanted either revisions, deletions, or addition of new information in the 70E standard. Out of that, they came up with the first draft, and they had, well over 150, 160 some odd revisions at that point. And then when the second draft came out, they ended up with another 73 revisions. So there have been quite a few changes. Now, if you're watching this program and you're a worker out in the field, your bottom line question is, well, how does this affect me? We're going to talk about that as we go through. If you're maybe a maintenance manager, EH&S manager, or a business owner, you're someone who's responsible for electrical safety in your facility or on your job site. You're required to have a written electrical safe work program, aren't you? And you know that. So you must have a documented electrical safety program. And the question is, well, if there are no great big changes, do I really have to revise my program? And the answer is, why wouldn't you? Yes, you have to revise your program. When it comes to safety, why wouldn't we want to keep our programs and our people up to date with the latest standards that are out there? It only makes sense. So, yes, we revise our program. There's no 70E police that's going to come out and come after us for not having a revised program. Where you're going to see it is what? Through the general duty clause and the OSHA requirements. You're required to provide your employees in a workplace that is essentially free from recognized hazards. The employer has responsibilities, and you, the employees, have responsibilities as well. In the unlikely and terrible event that something bad should happen, you need to be able to justify your electrical safety program. Why wouldn't you want it to meet the latest codes and standards? Anyway, so let's move on into the information, see what we can find out. Now, the very first thing, before I even get into the information, there's one thing I want to go over with the workers out there. And it's a change in, we'll see where the change comes up in Article 120, but it's when we do our live, dead, live test. So, for whatever reason, I want you to see this first off. Live, dead, live. And it's pretty simple change. It's a little change in wording. Let's take a look. So let's say I've got this disconnect. And I'm going to go in, I've de-energized, I've thrown the handle down, so the fuses should be de-energized. Maybe I've shut off the upstream breaker disconnect as well, so it should be de-energized. The change is that it says when I do this live dead live test, where what? I verify my meter works first on a known source, Then I'm going to check and verify my circuit's de-energized. Then I go back and I make sure my meter's still working properly, don't I? That's the live, dead, live test. Now, the change is where we're going to measure the voltage on the inside, or the absence of voltage, I should say, on the inside. And it always says at the point of work now is what it's making clear. So in other words, if I've shut off the upstream breaker, say to this disconnect, of course, yes, I would come up to the top and I would verify phase to phase and phase to ground that I get 0 volts. Then go back and make sure my meter's still working properly. But what if I'm replacing the fuses down here? It says I also have to come down to the fuses now and check as well. So I need to check phase to phase and phase to ground on each one of those fuses. Wherever it is I'm working inside of my disconnect switch, MCC bucket, whatever it is, control panel. The reason is, you think of it, my incoming power is de-energized. The fuses should be dead. The handle is pulled anyway. What if I'm getting backfeed? Suppose I've got a motor down there spinning. Something's going on. Whatever. Somehow I'm getting some backfeed into these fuses, and I could find myself in serious trouble. And I've seen that happen to people. So that key change, we'll see where that is. Anyway, I'll put up many of the major changes to things that are important to us. So think about it. How does this apply to my work? We'll talk a little bit about that. And we'll also talk about how you need to revise your program. Keep it up to date. Alrighty? So let's put it up on the screen and talk about this stuff. So the NFPA 70E, Standard for Electrical Safety in the Workplace, actually became effective, it says, on May 13th, 2023. So it's been around for a little while, well before we get into 2024. Some of the changes that occurred, first is that item electric shock. So practical side of this, I think it was pretty obvious when the standard referenced the term shock, we were probably talking about electric shock. But remember, we also, well, back in the annex on capacitors, it talks about the shock wave effect of an exploding capacitor and so forth. But we know that there are other forms of shock as well. For instance, I was in a electrical accident many years ago and had 4th degree burns on my hand and almost lost my hand. And I took my hand after the accident. I was by myself and I hid it under my jacket. I had 2 workers came by and say, "Hey, you're okay. You look pretty bad." My response was, "Oh, I'm just fine. Don't worry about it. I'm okay. You know, I was an adult and I was embarrassed at what had happened and so forth." So keep in mind that there are requirements for responding to electrical accidents in the 70E standard. We have to be trained on how to respond if we're going to be a person who responds. We have to be trained in AEDs if they're available. We have to be trained in CPR and also in methods of contact release. Keep in mind that when we're evaluating that situation, there may be other types of shock going on in addition to electric shock that we have to take care of. The term protectors, and it has to do with these rubber gloves, and there's a reference to it in 130.7. But we've often called these the leather protectors, and that go over the rubber gloves. And there's been a change in that term. We no longer use the term leather because there are other type of protectors out there as well. The general rule in 130.7 is that we always have to wear our leather protectors over our insulated voltage-rated rubber gloves. However, keep in mind in that section that you see on the screen, 130.7C7, there is a provision where I do not have to wear my leather protectors over my rubber glove. However, that changes my requirements quite a bit. I have to retest my voltage-rated gloves as soon as I'm done using them. I can't use them in any place where they might be subject to damage and so on. So anyway, those specific requirements are in 130.7C7. Now there are definitions. All of the definitions have been moved to Article 100. There are 2 new definitions I want you to be aware of. It's for ionizing and non-ionizing radiation. If you're like me, you read the definitions and you go, okay, whatever. But keep in mind, there are 2 types of radiation. The first may be non-ionizing radiation, the first type. So non-ionizing. In the studio where I am, there are some lights, plenty of lights. And those lights are radiating, the light fixtures themselves are radiating some visible light, part of that visible spectrum to me. That's considered to be non-ionizing radiation. But then we have ionizing radiation. Ionizing radiation, different part of the spectrum, and it delivers enough energy, so much energy that it can actually knock electrons free from an atom. Well, the practical side of that is where we see that out in the field is corona. Okay, and then so if you have medium or high voltage systems in your facilities and locations, then you may be aware of this effect of corona, where some of the electrons actually escape out into the air, knock electrons loose from atoms in the air, and ionize that surrounding air. Then that's generally bad news for us because that surrounding air becomes a fairly good conductor, that ionized air. So anyway, we can measure that corona effect. We can listen to that ultrasonic sound with the right type of test equipment. That type of test equipment, we call it partial discharge test equipment, and we do partial discharge testing. If you need more information on that, take a look at NFPA 70B. If you have it, well, if you've got medium and high voltage, you have it. And if you're not maintaining your equipment properly, that corona effect can present you with some serious problems later on. It's an inefficiency in our systems as well. Where we see the references in 70E to ionizing radiation is if we take a look in Articles 330 and 340. Article 330 is on lasers, and Article 340 is on, let's see how that's titled. It's Article 340, Safety-Related Work Practices, Power Electronic Equipment. And you may say, well, I don't work on lasers, and I certainly don't work on any power electronic equipment, whatever the heck that is. Really? Do you have variable speed drives? How about that charger for your electric forklift? Those are just a couple of base examples of power electronic equipment that we need to be aware of. And we often don't pay a lot of attention to that article, unfortunately, but it's Article 340 in the 70E standard DIN. Another way that they've laid out, if you look at the definitions, if you have your 70E standard with you, is the way that they've laid out the definitions is they put terms in parentheses after the definition, and they say that's to allow for electronic searching. So if you're familiar with some of the older editions of the 70E, we used to be able to buy a PDF of the standard. Not so anymore. Okay, you have to go online and you can look at it in real time online. And I think some of the changes, just my thought, if you were to look down the road, think of this. If I were to look down the road, years from now, and I had a copy of the standard, and I had a PDF copy, that's it. Whenever I bought that, that was the copy that I have, or the hard copy. That's the copy that I have. What if that standard was going to change in real time? What if they changed it today and it became effective today? I don't have any hard copies of anything that's going to show me that, so that information is going to be online. So anyway, we see more of a push towards the electronic world when it comes to our codes and standards. Just something to think about, huh? Let's take a look at Article 90 very briefly. So at the beginning of each one of these articles, they've added .1, which is the scope, which I like that. If you go through and you look at the different articles, you'll find they really give you some good information. .2 is now the purpose. 90.2 is the purpose, and that hasn't changed at all. I do want to point out to you 90.5C and show you a little example. Let's just go through and look at the example. Let's go to 110.4A. So 110.4A, and if you've got your standard, that is on page 18 of the standard, right at the very top. But the informational note references the National Electrical Code, which is fine. It says, see NFPA 70 National Electrical Code for further information concerning installation requirements. Yes, we should know that information in the NEC, right, as it applies. Now, 90.5C makes it clear that if it doesn't specify the date after National Electrical Code, which this one does not, then it assumes that you're using you are to use the most current edition of the NEC then, or whatever the standard it is that's referencing. Article 110 is the general requirements for electrical safety related work practices. What they did in the very beginning, 110.2, 110.3 now, I say they've removed a lot of the confusion. If you remember, in the older edition, there was a section that said you can't work on anything while it's energized. Everything must be put into an electrically safe work condition, period. Then the next section said, well, you can go ahead and work on it if it's energized, if you're, and it gave the rules for that, for if it's more dangerous to shut the power off or infeasibility and so on. Now what they've done with section 1.2 is they've combined that information together and they've made it easier for us to understand. So I think that is a good section to read, certainly, but it was also a good plus for the 2024 edition. 110.3 is interesting. Now 110.3 covers job safety planning. And we've had several steps, it's been in several editions of the NFPA 70E now, that we do a written job safety plan before we do our electrical work. There's a new edition that says we must have an emergency response plan as part of that job safety plan. So it goes back to some of your training once again and what all you're going to cover in the training and how you're going to cover that emergency response. You certainly, at your facilities and job sites, you have your own procedures for emergency response. By all means, you follow those. But if you think about it, a lot of people, I've heard people say, well, that's crazy. By the time you go up there and you shut the power off, it's already going to be, well, wait a minute. Then there's something wrong in your job safety plan. Part of your emergency response plan should be, the first item should be shut the power off if something bad goes wrong. Yeah, but it's too far to disconnect. No, maybe you need a second person, you see. So think about it. Maybe you need another person with a radio or with inside of that equipment being able to stand there and throw that disconnect or break or whatever it is and shut the power off. So your emergency response plan and your job safety plan definitely tie together. Now we have the requirement in 110.3 to address that emergency response plan as part of job safety planning. Article 120, we've already talked a little bit about that point of work in 110.26 is the term that they use there at the bottom of the screen behind me. But anyway, 120.5, locating sources, as a new informational note. Let's take a look at that informational note. The informational note in 120.5 says, locating sources of supply could include identifying situations where a neutral conductor continues to carry current after phase conductors have been de-energized. So what they're talking about is locating all the different sources of supply. And now there's the information, such as maybe a standby generator or UPS battery, something like that. But now it also mentions that neutral conductor. And we know, depending on how our circuit is laid out, that even though we open up the breaker, de-energizing the ungrounded hot conductors going to our load, we can still have current flow through that neutral conductor. It still can be a current-carrying conductor carrying current flow from other parts of a circuit. So it's just giving us that informational note to make sure that we're aware of that. 110.25b2 then, in that same section, addresses stored energy and particularly stored mechanical energy. There's a little rewording. It says, other sources of stored energy shall be blocked or otherwise relieved. And then it goes on, the revision is, it gives us a little more description, to the extent that the circuit cannot be unintentionally energized. Also, there's a new informational note that references you back to Article 360 on capacitors for stored energy as well. And we've covered 120.6. Remember that when you're doing that test, that live, dead, live, always go to your point of work and check and double check and triple check and quadruple check, whatever you need to do to make sure that you feel that you're safe. It's okay for you finally to take your rubber gloves off and go in there and do some work, all righty? Make sure you follow that 120.6 then. Article 130 is work involving electrical hazards. There's been a change to the shock protection boundaries table, 130.4E. That's on page 26, once again, if you're following along. And it looks like very minor changes. They have added a new line in there on the AC shock protection boundaries, and they've broken up the medium voltage levels. So now we have 751 to 5 kV and 5.1 kV to 15 kV. And what's changed is the restricted approach boundary distances have changed by 1 inch. Okay, certainly nothing major there, but it's to conform with the requirements for rounding our numbers off. Now you say, well, that doesn't affect me at all. Well, it will one day, right? When you look at a label on an old piece of equipment and right over here is your new piece of equipment, you say, hey, the restricted approach boundaries are different on these two pieces of equipment. It's only an inch. I wonder who screwed up. Nobody screwed up, okay? It's just that the standard has changed, and we're going to start seeing changes out there in the field for that. 130.5H talks about equipment labeling, and it says the label must be durable for the environment. We know that, so we don't use things like permanent markers, do we, and so forth. When it comes to arc flash warning labels, we make sure that we buy from a reputable supplier. We use the proper type of label. It will meet all the ASTM standards and so forth, so make sure that it's durable for that environment. 130.7 C7A, there's been a change in terminology. And if you take a look at that, it's on page 31. So page 31, there's a table, and it talks about the maximum use voltage for rubber gloves. In the very last column, it says the distances between protector cuff and rubber insulating glove cuff, and it gives a minimum distance in. So for instance, I have on some class 2 gloves, and I put on my leather protector over the voltage rated glove, and there's a minimum distance from the end of what they used to call the gauntlets, right? So we used to talk about the gauntlet and the end of the cuff and so forth. Now they just simplified it, thank goodness. It says distance between the protector cuff and the rubber insulating glove cuff. So for these class 2 gloves, it says that's a minimum of 51 millimeters or 2 inches thin. So I think that was a good change, simplified the terminology for us. 130.8M, I do want to point out to you. 130.8 is on reclosing circuits, and this is an important section. There used to be the term repetitive in there, and it says repetitive no more. It didn't allow us, actually the original requirement just simply was that you could not repetitively close circuits after a fault. So if you had fuse blow or circuit breaker, whatever, you had to investigate the fault and find out why the breaker had tripped or the fuse had blown before you re-energized the circuit. So they removed the term repetitive to make sure that everybody understands that. So if I have a breaker tripped, and I know you may have heard, well, you can reset it one time. You can go ahead and reset it and try it again one more time. That's not what the standard says. No, that's incorrect. It says that you have to have a qualified person investigate the reason for that trip or that blown fuse. You find the cause, correct it, and then you go ahead and re-energize the circuit. And finally, let's talk about the new Informative Annex S. It's called Assessing the Condition of Maintenance. And we've seen this, and right at the very bottom, there's S8, right? And it says NFPA 70B. So here are the 8 sections out of that Informative Annex. The introduction, fine. It says we have to assess the risk. We know that, and we talk about normal operating condition of electrical equipment, whatever, way back in 70. And by the way, there's been a little change in terminology on that. But we do our visual inspections in S3. S4, we should do periodic testing and of inspections, and we may have permanently installed monitoring equipment, S5. S6 talks about the different predictive techniques. It's nice to know when equipment's going to fail, in other words, become unsafe before it does. That's a good thing to know. And we have to examine our maintenance history, right? Anytime before we go to operate or work on any electrical equipment and so forth. And so there's some really good information there. The bottom line is it ties you to the NFPA 70B standard, which is newly published, and it went from a recommended practice on electrical equipment maintenance to a standard on electrical equipment maintenance, meaning that the terminology in 70B went from recommend you do this, good idea you do this, you should do this, you should do that, whatever, to you shall do this, you shall do that, and so on. So anyway, that is Informative Annex S, and you should definitely take a look at that, but tie that into your electrical safety program with NFPA 70B as well. So that's about all the time we've got for today. We've hit what I think are the high points and the important things that we need to know about the changes to the 70E 2024 edition then. So make sure that you update your programs as needed. Make sure that you get your 3-year retraining requirement met, not only to update yourself on the changes to 70E, but to refresh yourselves on your programs and the basics of electrical safety. Once again, I'm Randy Barnett. Thanks for attending today. Hope you got some good stuff out of it. Remember that this Tech Talk is brought to you by EC&M Magazine. They're part of the portfolio of Endeavor Business Publications. So until next time, work safely.